like to welcome everyone to chesslecture.com. I have a video presentation for you on Rook Endgames. Title of this presentation is Rook Endgames by the Masters. I have several games to present, all from the endgame, in this case all Rook endings. So, the first example for today is from the famous game Salo Floor, that's Floor playing white, against Milan Vidmar, Slovenian master. This game is from Nottingham, a very, very famous tournament, Nottingham 1936. I'm sure you'll find that in your databases. So, first let's take a look at the static features of this position. The last move by black was b takes c6. He recaptured a knight on c6. You have to look at the pawn structure. The long-term features of the position are very important. And here white has 2 pawn islands against black's 3. So white has pawns, 1 island on the king side, h2, g2, you see me highlighting it there, f3 and e4. That's 1 pawn island. The pawns all capable of protecting each other. Black has 3 pawn islands, including an isolated pawn highlighted on a6. This is a static weakness. Black also has a weakness at c6, which I've also highlighted. This is the problem. This pawn can't move. It could potentially be a good pawn, the pawn on c6, but it's right now immobilized by the white rook, very well placed at c5. Before I go through the main moves in this game, I'd like to just go over a few general rules that are very important, especially in Rook endgames, but in any endgame. The activity of the pieces. Whose pieces are better and more actively placed? In this example, Floor Vidmar, we have the rook on c5. The white rook at c5 is extremely well placed. Very important to understand, compared to its black counterpart. Now white played here king e2, approaching the center with his king, very logical. So the first rule in the endgame, are my pieces more active than the opponent's? The answer for white is here, yes. He has the more active rook, it's attacking. Black's rook is just defending. He also has the more active king now. Having just played king e2, Floor centralizes his king. It's obviously coming up to d3 and heading to centralize at d4. In order for black to activate his rook, he first has to activate his king and bring it to d6. So far we have 2 general things in the position that we have to understand. The pawn structure, whose pawn structure is better? White. The pieces, whose pieces are more active? White. So these 2 factors lead to a very serious advantage for white in this game. Oftentimes it's not enough to win, but there are very good chances if your technique is good. And here we have a player, Salo Floor, who had fantastic technique, a great player all around. So you see an excellent example in this game how to execute an advantage in the rook endgame. King e2, black responded now, king e7, natural, king d3, and king d6. At this moment, white plays, logically, rook a5. Rook a5, the rook is under attack, but attacking the a6 pawn. This forces black's hand. He has no time to activate with a move like c5. He's forced again to put his rook in another passive position. So white has improved his position. He's kept his rook in an active square and been able to improve his king. Now, what is the threat? Black can play c5. This would be a very strong move. White cannot allow that under any circumstances. So king d4, of course, preventing c5. This is a problematic position for black. What can he do? If he moves his king, the white king will encroach into the position further with king c5. Perhaps the best defense for black is to do nothing with a move like rook to a7. But slowly white will improve. b4, perhaps a3, eventually break. But it's not easy to see how white can win this position. So, this leads us to our next important feature and rule in the endgame. It's very important. Even though you have a great advantage, it might not be enough to win on its own. White here has a better rook, better king, and better pawn structure. Still, he has no entry, no way to break into black's position. So this brings us to the next important factor that's especially important in rook endgames, but all endgames, and of course chess in general. That is the concept of multiple weaknesses. Basically, the principle of 2 weaknesses, it's called by many. You have to create a second weakness in the opponent's position, oftentimes in order to win. And we're going to see in the examples today many situations where the winning method involves creating a second weakness. In order to do that, Floor simply has to create a way for his king to get into the position, or for his rook to have more lines to attack black. He plays here, very interesting move, after black's response, f5, b4. No immediate creation of a second weakness. This move is simply sealing down the c5 square, ensuring black never gets any counterplay. Of course, if black plays rook b8 here, white just plays a3. It's as simple as that. This is what happens. Rook b8, a good attempt to get active. So the black rook is no longer blocked behind its own pawn on a8. It's now more active on b8. White simply plays a3. Now the a6 pawn is still attacked. We have to defend it. There's no choice whatsoever. Here, I'm not really sure if it's objectively better or worse, but black played rook a8. And the reason this might be better than rook b6 is that the rook actually has two squares. It can move back and forth from a7 to a8, rather than where on b6 it would have no squares, no waiting moves at all, and black could slowly become in a situation where he's in Zugzwang. So, basically black doesn't want that. He leaves his rook in a position where it's passive, but he can move back and forth in last resort from a8 to a7. White has a big advantage, but how to break through. Now this is the classic creation of two weaknesses. Floor has to find another way through. So he plays e4. e4, breaking the black position, eliminating the strong pawn on d5. White has three pieces, the rook at a5, the pawn at e4, the king at d4, all attacking d5. Black is going to have to give up that point now, and that means something very important. Look at the white rook on a5. Now look at its mobility on the fifth rank. With this move e4, what white can do is forcibly create a situation where suddenly his rook has a lot more squares. So in this game, Floor versus Vidmar, this is what happened. e4, breaking the position open. So now, d takes e4, f takes e4. Again, black is very limited. He has nothing he can do. He has to take. His f5 pawn is attacked twice. F takes e4, king takes e4. At first glance, it looks like white has made a little bit of progress, but there's a risk that white's running also that if he exchanges too many pawns, he might be unable to win. Keep this in mind. The less pawns on the board, the harder it is often to win. But in this case, Floor had to exchange some pawns simply to open the position a little bit, so he had room to move and create a new threat. And the new threat is on the king's side. So after the ninth move in this endgame, we have king takes a4, and black now resorting to his waiting strategy, rook a7. He doesn't want to move his king and give white any new squares. He'd prefer not to move the pawns, so he simply makes a waiting move. Good enough, rook a7. However, white has ways to improve his position. King f4. Now it becomes clear the second target is the black king side, the h7 and g6 pawns. Already black has one weakness on a6. Now white is trying to create a second weakness in the black king side pawns. And black plays h6. So, there's no entry point for the white king now. And there's no way to immediately attack those h6 and g6 pawns. White needs a way in, but how? And he finds it. This is very crafty. He sometimes has to find a way to use his own pawns to create open squares. So he uses his pawns now to find a way to get his king into black's position. h4. This is so key. Because if he can play h5, white can, black will push past or capture, and will have the f5 square for the white king. Or even for the white rook, for that matter. In some lines, the white rook can come in through f5 and f6. Imagine that. So an entry point for either the white king or the white rook. Incredible progress for white. What can black do to stop it? Basically nothing. He has to resort to moving back and forth. King e6, king g4, preparing h5 so as that move won't be a pawn sacrifice. Famous endgame teacher Cherishevsky talks about these kind of things in his writings, and he says it's very important to be patient in the endgame. So slowly prepare everything, because every little detail makes a big difference. There's no rush for white to be hurrying and playing h5. he simply plays king g4 first. This has several good reasons to be played. First of all, you don't want to allow black to have a check with the rook at f7. Perhaps the king on f4 could be checked at an inconvenient moment. The king is safe from checks on g4 and helps prepare the advance h5. So after king g4, again, black has nothing active he can do. He plays the waiting move rook a8. This is the advantage of having the rook on a8 or a7 as opposed to b6, where the rook would be paralyzed. So he was right to keep the rook on a8. Rook a8 now, played in the game, and h5, logical. Now what can black do? If he takes on h5, the white king will take on h5, and there will be no way to defend both the h6 pawn and the a6 pawn. And most likely, that would be an easy win for white. So black plays the more stubborn g5. But now everything is clear as far as white's plan. The h6 pawn is the second weakness. It's very instructive the way the floor has played this. One weakness at a6, another weakness at h6. And this is enough to win the game. A perfect illustration of the concept of two weaknesses. h6, the weak point. So, white plays now a very patient move, and I'm not sure this is necessary, g3. White is just waiting. There's no definite, clear reason he has to play g3. I'm not going to argue that it's the only move, but it's a patient waiting move, and it creates a moment where maybe black will make a mistake. Perhaps the best move is rook a7 for black here. What if he plays an inferior move? We can just play g3 and see what he does. Notice, if the black king goes to f6, he might have problems with his c6 pawn. If the black king goes to d6, then the f5 point is an entry point for white, for the king or the rook. So g3 is like a waiting move. Rook a7, correctly defending Vidmar. Vidmar was a very, very smart man, but he was not a chess professional. He was a strong amateur, a scientist and mathematician in Slovenia. Floor, of course, slightly superior player, putting the pressure on Vidmar here. Rook a7, though, black hanging tough. Now, king f3. Again, just patiently waiting. The white king comes back to e4. Basically, with the king on e4, black is going to slowly run out of moves. You will see. King e4, and then what can black do? He has to go back. Rather, king f3, rook a8, king e4, rook a7. What else can black do? Nothing. Any other move would afford white a breakthrough at f5. Perhaps the white king can even go the other way, from d4 to c5. If the black king goes too far to the right, on our right, to f6, white king can penetrate to d4, c5. It's a little bit like a king and pawn endgame, where you have the opposition. Either way the opponent goes, we go the other way, whether it's the weakness at c6 or the weakness at h6. So, rook a7, king f3, now, rook a8, king e4, rook a7. We've seen these moves. King d4. White threatens to go to c5 with his king. This is very serious. What does black play? Of course, opposing his king with king d6, not allowing access to the c5 square for the white king. But there's a problem. The f5 square is open now. This is a possible threat. But notice how patient, again, white is. No immediate attempt to do anything, simply repeating moves, trying to tire his opponent out. King e4, king e6. White can't possibly spoil the position by repeating it. Just wait and see if he can find a way to make progress. And now he makes a useful move. Rook e5 check. And this opens up a whole new dimension to this endgame. Suddenly, the rook transfers itself from a5 to attack the pawn on h6, perhaps from the side or perhaps from behind with rook e8. White changes gears completely. He now forgets about the a6 pawn and moves his attack to the h6 pawn with a rook. And that's all he has to focus on now, trying to win the h6 and g5 pawns. That would guarantee white a 1 endgame. Rook e5 check, king d6, and this gets very clear now. Rook e8. What can black do? An exchange of rooks on e7 would leave white in a winning king and pawn endgame. Too much space with the king and the better pawn structure. there'd be no way black can defend the king and pawn endgame with his pawn weaknesses and less space. So black cannot exchange rooks. He has to look for an active defense. He tries here to break out with c5. Otherwise, white was simply playing rook h8 to get behind the h-pawn. But c5 also doesn't help. It's a kind of panic, but there was nothing black could do. c5, rook d8 check. And now the black king has to go somewhere. I don't know where, whether you go to e7, c7, both very bad choices. e6 simply loses the c5 pawn. For example, if the black king were to go to e7, let's say we play it on the board, king e7, now rook h8, threatening not only the h-pawn, but to win the black rook with rook h7. So this wouldn't help. So let's go back to the original position at the end here, and after rook d8 check, he played king c6. Sadly, this is a blunder, but it's hard to call this move a blunder in a position where there was really no hope. Black loses the c5 pawn now, cleanly, has no counterplay. Rook c8 check, and what can he do? Nothing. Black resigned. He's losing the c5 pawn for absolutely nothing, and he remains with weak pawns at h6 and a6. But there was nothing he could do. He was never given a chance to activate his pieces. And look at the black rook. It never left this pathetic position behind the black pawn at a6. A very instructive example how to create two weaknesses in the opponent's position. This was our first example. Now we're going to go to another example, slightly different but with similar features. And again, we're going to talk about the three things that are most important in the rook endgame. King and piece position, the king and rook position and activity, pawn structure, and the creation of two weaknesses. Our second example features two very famous players as well. Akiba Rubinstein, one of the great endgame wizards of all time, maybe the greatest rook and pawn endgame player of all time, playing the white pieces, and the former world champion Emanuel Lasker, one of the greatest players also of all time, playing black. This game took place St. Petersburg, 1909. Rubinstein was about 27, Emanuel Lasker still in his prime, 40 years old or so. So St. Petersburg, 1909, they reached this position. It was a great game all around. I recommend you look it up, because the opening and the middle game were also instructive. It looked like Lasker was on the attack, but Rubinstein just met him blow for blow and reached this rook endgame where he's clearly better, almost winning, but this takes technique. In the board position, it's Rubinstein's move. He's in check. So what do? You're two pawns up, but what do you do to activate? Problem is, Lasker was a great endgame player too. He understands the concepts that I'm teaching here. Now, first question we ask ourselves, what about the pawn structure? Who's better? Look at the pawn structure. This isn't so much about structure as it is about quantity of pawns. We've got the better structure because we have more pawns. White is up 2 pawns. There's also a structural advantage in the fact that the a7 pawn is isolated. It's a weakness. So we have material advantage and a weakness at a7. The same can be said for the white pawn at e3, also potentially a weakness. But white to move. If you bring the king up, you're going to lose a pawn to rook d2 check. This was the game continuation. King f2, rook d2 check. What else can Lasker do? The problem is, in order to regain one of his 2 lost pawns, what did he have to do? One of the things we talked about. Allow the opponent to have active pieces. Rook d2 check. The king comes up now. King f3, keeping g2 protected, keeping e3 protected, bringing the king to the center. Rook takes b2. Now it's only a 1-pawn deficit, but white has the perfect move here. Rook a5. So, almost symmetrical looking position. White is up just 1 pawn, the e3 pawn. The problem is it's converted into more than just a pawn advantage. In order to win back one of the 2 pawns that Lasker was down, he had to forfeit something. He had to allow white to have great king position, and he had to allow his own rook to be subjected to a passive position. And now what can he play? He must play rook b7. Rook b7, white is up a pawn. He has the better rook, the better king. How to win. Another example of how to win, we have a weakness at a7. What is the other weakness that black has in this position? His pawn deficit. So there's a second weakness in the white pawn, using this pawn to go down the board and create a queen. Another weakness that black has in this position, he has to defend constantly against the white pawn advancing down the board. Let's see if that's enough to win of its own right, or maybe white has to create even further weaknesses in black's position. So, what's the right move now? e4, some king or pawn move, h4 maybe, grabbing space? No. This is very, very good technique, a principled move. Before advancing his own pieces, Rubinstein understood that it's best to limit the opponent's pieces, maximize his rook position, rook a6. Now that's the kind of move that's a mark of a great endgame player. Perfect technique, keeping black pinned down to just 2 ranks. Now what can black do? No active defense at all. Absolutely no active defense at all. King f8. Black prefers not to touch his pawns and create weaknesses thereby. e4. Now watch the way that Rubinstein advances here, not just throwing his e-pawn down the board by itself, but everything advances together. Black makes waiting moves. Rook c7, the 5th move of our endgame. Now look, very important that the white pieces, everything acts as a unit and moves together in one consistent formation. So, not just e4, e5, e6, white brings everything up together. Now h4. First e4, now h4. Black can only wait. King f7, g4. It's important that Rubinstein uses all of his pieces here, all of his pawns. He doesn't have a great material advantage. He has 1 pawn advantage. And he needs to bring everything he can, all the pressure he can to bear on black's position in order to win this. g4 now. So everything starts moving up. And notice how black is tied down on his own 3rd rank because of the rook at a6, the very accurate move. Now king back to f8, king f4. Perhaps Lasker hoped that he could just hold the line and white couldn't break through, which maybe, if it was a position where there were no pawns on the king side, just 2 against 1, it could be a little bit difficult. But white is able to create even more weaknesses in black's position, as you'll see. Similar to our first example. So after king f4, king e7, h5. Sooner or later, white is going to make contact with the black pawns and force some kind of weakness in the black position. At this point, he's just going to keep pushing g5, maybe h6. Imagine g5 and h6 getting that in, and black would have to decide whether to take on h6 or play g6 and create a weakness at h7. Very similar to Floor's technique in winning the first example of our lecture. King f4, king e7, h5, and h6. Perhaps this isn't the best move, and it creates a weakness at g6. There was very little that Lasker could have done. Eventually, white was going to play g5, h6, maybe created a weakness at h7. Lasker thought, well, maybe I'd rather have the pawn on h6. Perhaps this is not as bad as the weakness on h7 with a pawn on h6 for white. He gains a little bit of space this way, but weakens the g6 square. Now white plays king f5, and the entry is clear. White creates a square at g6 from where to penetrate into black's position. A new weakness is born at g7, a current weakness at a7, and the white pawn itself a sort of weakness for black. King f5, threatening penetration. King f7, again, opposition to the white king. White has too many waiting moves here. And simply advancing in the center with e5, also good. This was played in the game. e5. Black can only wait. Rook b7. Rook d6 for white. King e7. Black is absolutely paralyzed. He could not leave the 7th rank with his rook with the king on f7 because white would have rook d7 check. skewering the black king on f7 to the a7 pawn. Only now does black, after king e7, threaten to activate his own rook with rook b2. But it's too late. White goes back to a6. Again, we're seeing a player, a great player, repeating position just for one or two moves till he gets everything in place. Rook a6, king f7, and now a different idea. Rook d6. This time, instead of king e7, black actually just made a mistake and played king f8. King e7 was probably a better try. Either way, white was winning with the simple move king g6. I believe that king g6 is probably enough for white to win after king e7. Perhaps not the most accurate, though. Let's look at that. If king e7, king g6, black may have counterplay with rook b4. I think white is winning here, but it looks like there's a little bit of counterplay against that g4 pawn. So perhaps if Lasker had been more stubborn and played king e7, going back to that position now on the board, played king e7, white could find a different way to make progress. But I think that king g6 is good enough. But he did not. He actually, I guess he was flustered, tired here, played king f8 instead. This is an inferior move. Now white plays rook c6. The rook is just a little bit more flexibly placed at c6 than it is at d6. It's more far away from the black king, more difficult to attack. This is a very important concept in any rook endgame as well. You want your rook to be placed as far away from the enemy king as possible. It has a greater checking distance, so to speak. You can check the opponent's king many times without the king actually being close enough to attack it. So you want it further away. Rook c6 is probably a better square than d6. After rook c6, king f7, ironically, white just played a3. And suddenly black was run out of moves. Absolutely run out of moves. He has no place to keep his rook on the 7th rank. He resigned in this position. Former world champion Lasker resigned. Where to put the rook? You can't go to c7. You can't go to d7 because of e6 check. You can't go to e7 because of e6 check and too much space. After a3, the final move of the endgame, Lasker resigned because he realized what this move does. For one thing, it's kind of cute. a3 would allow king e7, king g6, and in that case, black wouldn't even have the move rook b4 that might have given him counterplay against white's g-pawn in the previous line that we looked at. So a3, a funny move, frustrating Lasker, he resigned. This was a quick example, not as illustrative as the first one, but sort of reinforcing the concepts that white needs to use in this kind of endgame. Slowly improving his king and his rook. Slowly, and most importantly, creating weaknesses in the opponent's position. That's the most important concept. Again, the creating weaknesses idea, pushing the pawn up to h5 to force open squares. He eventually forced Lasker to play h6 and got his king into g6. Similar strategies from the first game. After this second example, we can sum up the general principles that we have to use in the rook endgame. We've learned from these masters improving the king position, assessing the pawn structure, looking for weaknesses. Number 2, active rook position. So active king position, active rook position, and number 3, creating weaknesses in the opponent's position using the strategy of the creation of 2 weaknesses. The principle of 2 weaknesses, king position and active rook, are the 3 things that create a winning recipe in rook and pawn endgames. So that's the end of this first lesson in rook endgames. Stay tuned to chesslecture.com for my part 2 on Master Rook Endgames.